Good evening. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate the 249th birthday of one of the world's literary giants, Jane Austen. My name is Nora Pehrson, and I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins studying 19th and 20th century literature. I'm excited to join you today to host and moderate this virtual discussion with Evelyne Ender. Evelyne is a senior lecturer in the Department of Comparative Thought and Literature here at Hopkins. She earned her doctorate at the University of Geneva with the publication Sexing the Mind, 19th Century Fictions of Hysteria in 1995. Her second book, Architects of Memory, Literature, Science, and Autobiography in 2005, won the Aldo Scaglione Prize for Best Book in Comparative Studies. Throughout her career, Evelyne has devoted special attention to mind and body issues, and at Hopkins, she teaches classes on literature and medicine. Evelyne's lecture today will highlight some of the extensive research she's done on the meaning and the science of reading for her book she's currently writing, titled Handwriting, an Inner History. Before I turn things over to Evelyne, I'd like to remind everyone tuning in live to please use the chat feature below to leave comments and ask questions during the lecture. We'll be monitoring the conversation and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A towards the end of our broadcast. Now, without further ado, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Evelyne.
Well, welcome, dear audience, wherever you are. It's really a pleasure to be here on this winter afternoon in the days before Christmas. And thank you also to Hopkins at home for this invitation. And thank you to Nora for all her help and for being here with me, sharing the screen and at times, and also helping with questions. But without further ado, I want to get into my presentation of a remarkably interesting writer whom I read and reread with great passion. And I'll start with a portrait of the heroine of the day. And here what you see is a black and white picture of Jane Austen, originally drawn by her sister Cassandra. It also existed later as a miniature portrait, the size of a medallion, where she wore a blue dress, and it was on watercolors and ivory. So a precious thing that you could actually put on display. What do you see? A modest, tasteful dress, a bonnet that gives it a homely tonality, but also striking eyes looking into some middle distance. What is she seeing? Perhaps some small event that pulled her away from mundane domestic tasks that left an impression, however, on her memory, or perhaps an actual scene, a young man complimenting a young lady with forced exaggeration on a portrait painted with skill but no real talent. Perhaps in her imagination right there, she has already invented a treasured scene that one day will be written into a novel such as Emma. The eyes, the mouth, the intensity goes outward. Cassandra sketches out for us an attitude of alertness and intelligence that holds all the promises of a vibrant and powerful imagination. Here then is the image of a literary genius, a genius singular and strong enough to cross decades and centuries, with a wit, a wisdom, and a humanity that can still enthrall and enchant us. And this is why we have this advanced celebration of this 250 years of Jane Austen's birth. And at Hopkins, of course, we pride ourselves of being ahead of the curve all the time. We turn to this remarkable achievement of a creator who, with pen, ink, and words alone, was able to give texture to a world of infinite, uncontainable complexity. Claire Tomalin, Austen's biographer, who spent several years scanning her text, tells us that in the end, she found her, Austen, just as elusive as a cloud in a night sky. She also tells us, Claire Tomalin, that Austen loved dancing and jokes, dreamt of finding a man she could marry, even as she apprenticed herself to writing novels. Meanwhile, it is because of the mystery, because of what lies in that brain and mind that produces a Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth and Emma or Anne Elliot, that we cannot cease reading her books. Like a magician, she has her charms, and she entices us with literary tricks that are so clever that to this day they can enthrall us into entering a world of pleasurable, entertaining reading that transports her into her world. Ink, words, and paper is all it took. A point that must be made forcefully and clearly at the outset of this presentation in an age when film versions and parodies abound, and when toddlers can't be initiated to her world in miniaturized cardboard versions of the text, or when you read her in companionship with zombies and with vampires. But in her own time, this is how one communicated in an age prior to electricity, when the penny post had just been invented in England. In fact, it had been happening for a long time, but it became more popular in those years. Also, most importantly, this is how Austen was able to fill a world with volatile and unpredictable creatures born from her observation and imagination, namely with her pen. Indeed, a world of infinite, uncontainable complexity is born at the tip of her pen. The lanes and roads of Hampshire, Bath, and London, the homes and the fairy tales, fairy castle that host her protagonists, the strong emotion that they feel, the noises of their conversation. The pen, or rather in her time, the quill, is what gives texture to the richest of phenomenal universe where her characters evolve not as puppets, but as three-dimensional figures with a mind of their own. Here is what the world looked like as caught in a lovely pastel done by a gifted artist who brought his skill all the way to Istanbul and then back to the European courts and to wealthy bourgeois families. The world of quiet reading of letters. And here is how, for instance, in the words of Austen in Mansfield Park, a young and naive Fanny, she is our example, our model, discovers with emotion from a letter sent by Miss Crawford that her beloved brother in the Navy had received a promotion. Her hand was trembling under these letters, eye running from one to the other, and her heart swelling with emotion. It was impossible that she should ever receive another so perfectly gratifying in the occasion and the style. To her, the handwriting itself, independently of anything it may convey, is a blessedness. Never were such characters cut by any other than any other human being. The specimen, written in haste as it was, had not a fault, and there was felicity in the flow of the first words, "My very dear Fanny," which she could have looked at forever. This is how she reads. Now, this is how she writes, Fanny. Quite practiced in note writing, had there been a time for scruples and fears as to style, she would have felt them in abundance. But something must be instantly written, and and with one only decided feeling, that of wishing to appear to think anything really intended, she wrote in great trembling, both of spirits and hand. She wrote in great trembling seem to me the important words, but as you might have gathered, both writing and reading are for her an emotional affair. And, one can but think about what Fanny would be doing now. Poor Fanny, if only she had been able to nimbly type out on her telephone a text message, and after meditating for a bit over the choice and the order of her emojis, pretend that it didn't take any effort or any time for her to actually find the words, or rather the signs, for exactly the right message. Now here is a lady writing with her quill. She is somebody that could be part of Austen's world, though maybe the red dress is a little too much, and maybe also that flush and blush on her cheeks as she's writing adds a note of, let's say, eroticism that's perhaps a little exaggerated. Be it as it may, paper, words written on it with a quill and read with emotion and concentration by a young person, these descriptions are meaningful, but they are a mere approximation, just as if each letter, unless recopied, would be unique, so is the feeling attached to each of these objects. Meanwhile, for those in those olden days who could read and write, letters represented the only means of expression and communication. And that's something to bear in mind. And as we will see in a moment, if you wonder what it felt like to write or receive letters in those years when Austen wrote her novels, the best places to discover what that experience was like is actually to go to Austen's novels. Not only to Mansfield Park, but also to Emma and especially Persuasion. These two books are going to be the center, the focal point, the anchoring point of this presentation. But what we are celebrating here on Austen's birthday is a singular achievement which was repeated again and again as she put pen to paper, namely that simple gesture through which, amazingly, the creatures and the world that we discover in her fiction is born. And that's where her genius lay, not in stitching, embroidery, and the art of conversation, however witty it may have been, but in summoning up a whole universe of human experiences in what were, before somebody printed them, just spidery lines covering pages after pages of precious, expensive paper. Jane Austen penned her books in a world without electricity, when telling stories and expressing what her characters felt and stuffing it between the pages of a book was the only way of representing what people did, said, and felt. Think about that. Did, said, and felt. When, for example, they had the good fortune of inhabiting a home in a small place called Highbury, which places us with Emma in the landscape of Surrey. In this presentation, I revisit the world of Austen's creative labors in light of present times, and a comparison between a world of manuscription and our present world where writing can be done by machine is the best entry point. So allow me to momentarily fast forward to a moment when, some 15 years ago or so, academics started writing books about the fast-changing world of communication made available by new technologies. Left, you have a book about the encroachment of email as made by the spread of portable computers. Right, you have a book that contemplates the exponential generation of messages and of a wordiness that, in the strange but meaningful words of Harper, the author, takes away our fleshiness. That is perhaps a question we can discuss in question time. What is the difference between wordiness and fleshiness when it comes to communication? Meanwhile, everybody agrees, or seems to agree, about the sometimes problematic, if not paralyzing effect on our social lives of having to attend to a surfeit of written communications. Email, for example, lures us into the disembodied virtual world in which communication is increasingly mechanical and machine-driven. Very recently, the famous contemporary novelist Anne Patchett wrote in an opinion piece about how she regretted the invention of email. Her sister was actually shocked. For her, it interferes with and distracts her from her creative tasks. She singles out as its only positive feature the way email enables her to stay in touch with her friends. Anne Patchett, the author of Bel Canto, with a long career behind her and on the news recently because she produced a corrected edition of her early bestseller, Bel Canto, Anne Patchett and Austen, one might say, are cut off from the same cloth. They invent fictional worlds filled with specific details that make them look real. Bel Canto, Patchett had realized over time, was filled with errors, and that's why she had to revise it. Austen, though, didn't get the same opportunity for careful revisions. Both Emma and Persuasion were published posthumously. She didn't have a chance to go over a manuscript even. But the most striking difference between these two novelists lies in the medium available for the production of their work, namely in the tools that enable the labor it takes to sketch out and bring to life a unique, distinctive, fictive world of their own making. And even though we still hear about writers who draft or even write the full manuscripts of their books in longhand, composing with the help of a machine, not a typewriter, of course, but an amazing device, the portable computer that increasingly behaves like a secretary, has radically changed how writers write. Here is a scene, a glimpse of the scene of writing in Austen's days. On the right, you have a portrait of Cassandra bending over the letters her sister had sent. It's a valuable depiction of what the gesture looked like in ideal circumstances, a ladylike presence absorbed in a seamless task with a pen perhaps running ahead of her thoughts. On the left is an example, the beginning of chapter 11, of how Austen etched her thoughts into a page in what is the draft of Persuasion. In that older scene of writing, the mind and the hand worked in tandem in the absence of electricity and technology, and of course, without the intervention of spell checkers. Access to information was much scarcer too. It seems insignificant in this context in which handwriting would have been for Austen an essential tool for expression, but also consider that handwriting would have been a primary source of information. Austen, who grew up with at her disposal a small library of personal books, had an education that involved 3 years of schooling in Oxford, Southampton, and Reading. In her time, everything that needed to be checked by way of information, everything that needed to be communicated was written by hand. And she wrote all her last novel, namely Persuasion, at an incredible speed in the space of about 1 year. And that's about 400 to 500 pages of manuscript. But what about her materials? Actual but relatively rare first-hand experiences, excursions to London, and the first extended stay in Bath in the mid-20s fed her imagination. And friends and family wrote about their experiences, in longhand, of course. For Persuasion, which I will discuss later, she had to draw from conversations and letters sent by her brothers, the only way for someone who has never gone out to sea to give substance to the maritime world that serves as a backdrop to Anne Elliot's romance with Captain Wentworth. And if you haven't read Persuasion yet, you're going to get some facts and incentive to do so later in my presentation. Here are the instruments of Austen's craft. On exhibit here, you have images of the physical props that make her an author. A fully finished book, deemed to be the first to identify her as a new talent among novelists, namely Emma, and the simple movable writing console that served as her desk. It traveled with her wherever she went, and she describes it as containing all her worldly wealth. The desk with letters she wrote is one of the treasures of the British Library, and that's the image that you see here, taken from an exhibit. Now, please consider and carefully and read the statement in the upper left corner, where you see a rare and often quoted description by her of how she conceived of her art. She was writing to her brother. As her admirers, we may think differently about the effects her artistry had on us, But one thing is sure, hers is a fine brush and an eye for details, as we will see again and again. What is accomplished by her work? While we know about her simple instruments, a quill, ink, paper, and words, how much she accomplishes with these can best be shown in two images. With a microscope, she invites us to observe a world up close in its minutiae, at the same time discovering its inhabitants as nestled in a social and moral geography involving neighbors and visitors. And that's a perspective that is best embodied, epitomized by a telescope. The latter, the telescope, is what can bring the remote world of Highbury into focus. With the right aperture and a good lens, the telescope tells us where to look. And there, I would argue, her sketches turn out to be as spirited as her brothers, and actually perhaps more filled with variety and glow than her brothers' works would ever be. Meanwhile, the microscope and the telescope can only serve as metaphors for reading experiences. All right, they can also serve, I should say, namely, they are the way of channeling to our minds in what has to be an attentive reading, the words that she has cast on the page in a language and a style that are uniquely her own. Let me rephrase that. Let me just say that the best rewards of reading Jane Austen lie in a mind, a mindset, a desire to actually read her closely, which is what the microscope seems to suggest. Why? Because it would seem that each word or each sentence will serve as a lens that enables us to discover a reality that is not our own. Stitched together, words, sentences, give the world she has created its texture. Such literary works, and of course her gift for language, are among the central ingredients of the fiction created by this brilliant mind. And with these, remember what her biographer told us. The night sky with its clouds is where the denizens of her world lie in wait for anyone who has time and the skill to grasp what her texts say. I owe these analogies to a book by Colin McGinn called The Power of Movies. A philosopher who is fascinated with cinema shares many deep insight into our minds and shows us how representations that we know that are not to be real can yet populate our minds with lasting images. Cinema, like books, or rather I should say reversing the order, books, like the movies, have this amazing capacity to guide and imprint our minds, or call it our consciousness, into an alien or alternative universe that nevertheless feels real to us. And I look at my script where I said it imprints our mind into an alien alternative universe. And I must be right, because what happens is that we're transported elsewhere. It's not that we are stamped with the novel, but we're transported elsewhere. There is a technical word for this. We call it suspension of disbelief. We, literary scholars, use it to describe a fairly common phenomenon that can still take place in movie houses or in front of your television. An overt or more discreet response to representations that can prompt tears and sometimes cheers. Of course, there are places where this analogy fails. Jane Austen's genius lies entirely with words, while her art can only be channeled through the tangible form and the shape of books. No screens for her. Living in Highbury? Question. It is indeed through the magic pen, her magic pen alone, that she holds us, her readers, enthralled in a fictional world made of paper creatures that move not like puppets, but like human beings in a world of her own making. But my central point is the following here. Here is an author, a creator of new worlds, who entices us to enter an alternate reality with a pen as her only tools. That simple device is what gives birth from scratch to an entirely new world. This is what happens when, for example, we step with Emma into an unknown, distant place that carries the name of Highbury. Note, the place name provides her with an empty frame that she will now fill for us with the teeming lives of humans. And note also that this question about what happens can be, and how it happens, can be answered, needs to be answered in two ways. Inside the book, there is our heroine and her world. Then, inside the author's mind and brain, equally teeming with life, are ideas, images, words that will bring to life her fictional universe. And I want you to be aware of that discrepancy, the discrepancy between what happens to the heroine and, in fact, what is happening at the same time as holding a pen, or a quill rather, Austen is drafting her novels. Some amazing things happen. For example, and note how I signal what is actually the case, namely an overlap between the two meanings of romances. There are two romances. There is, in quotation marks, the figure, the person, the character of Emma, and then on the other side, there is the book. But the two somehow come together. But just note for the moment how adept Austen is at creating Emma's inner voice, but also the way she plots and plans the lives of others. So, for example, that of her protégée, Harriet. When it turns out that the latter cannot attend the Christmas party at Emma's home because of a sore throat, she's terribly upset that her plan for the best possible introduction to her potential husband, that is Harriet's potential husband, Frank Churchill, will go awry in her world. And here is how it goes. The hair was curled and a maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and to be miserable. It was a wretched business indeed, such an overthrow of everything that she had been wishing for, such a development of everything most unwelcome, such a blow for Harriet. You see the number of exclamation marks here. That was the worst of all. It's very dramatic, in other words. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or other, but compared with the evil to Harriet, all was light. And she would very gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistaken, the she being Emma. Emma would have preferred to be even more mistaken, more in error, more disgraced by the judgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. So Emma is both naive, deceived, and kind and attentive, but you cannot help but detect the kind of irony that is used here by Austen to write a short passage like this. Now, in this world, when Emma is bored, all kinds of things can happen, and Nora is going to read to you what kinds of things can happen when Emma is bored. Thank you, Nora.
Sure. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to the how much. At first, she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards but little. She had great pleasure in hearing Frank Churchill talked of, and for his sake, greater pleasure than ever in seeing Mr. and Mrs. Weston. She was very often thinking of him, and quite impatient for a letter, that she might know how he was, how were his spirits, how was his aunt, and what was the chance of his coming to Randalls again this spring. But, on the other hand, she could not admit herself to be unhappy, nor, after the first morning, to be less disposed for employment than usual. She was still busy and cheerful, and, pleasing as he was, she could yet imagine him to have faults. And further, though thinking of him so much, and as she sat drawing or working, forming 1,000 amusing schemes for the progress and close of their attachment, fancying interesting dialogues, and inventing elegant letters, the conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. Their affection was always to subside into friendship. Everything tender and charming was to mark their parting, but still they were to part. When she became sensible of this, it struck her that she could not be very much in love, for in spite of her previous and fixed determination never to quit her father, never to marry, a strong attachment certainly must produce more of a struggle than she could foresee in her own feelings.
Thank you, Nora. As you must have perceived, to be or not to be in love is the question here. But what's fascinating is to see the kind of overlap we have between a figure that's in the book, namely Emma, who worries about matches, and outside of the book, that same person, namely the writer, who is trying to make us see what is the case when Emma is a little too bored. The critic, the literary critic Nicola Bradbury, is very helpful here when she actually alerts us to the challenge that Austen had to face when she was writing this novel. The challenge was that she actually had to herself present a plot that was double and that would deceive everyone, the readers, as well as the actors, so to speak, in the novel. So Nicola Bradbury tells us that what's happening in this book is that Austen is tiptoeing between two romantic secrets. As a result, the book is delightfully filled with surprises and irony. Who doesn't remember Emma's famous awakening to her feelings? It darted through her mind with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must love no one but herself. Love is blind, the saying goes, but somehow Austen turns this maxim on its head in placing in Emma's head such an amazing blindness that it takes an extraordinarily long time and many pages for her to see the obvious. Here, there was a suitor right at her door, so to speak, visiting her almost daily at her father's house, and moreover, ready to offer her an establishment that was just there for her to take up. But she couldn't see it. She remained blind. She kept deluding herself, and that is part of the humor and the suspense, you might almost say, of how Austen writes her novels. What's at the heart of the books that Austen writes is a genre called the romance. And there is, in fact, so much romance in the air in Highbury that near the end of the novel, you have the feeling that the whole village is abuzz with gossip about who gets the girl, or rather, who the girl will marry. On the left, you have, in an illustration, a glimpse of this world as shown in an illustrated version of Emma. On the right, you have an apt complement, Henry James' ever so savvy definition about how the romance, when placed in the right hands, can feel. It feels as if lifting you up from the ordinary world in a hot air balloon. And I can think of no more intelligent as well as maybe poetic definition for what novels that are romantic novels try to create. But there's another element here. The element has to do with how Austen, with supreme skill, is capable of placing in our heads aspects of social relations, economic relations, and familial and erotic elements that all belong to the language that is spoken by the people of Highbury, or in her other novels, the people of London or of Bath. The literary critic Patricia Meyer Spacks argues that people talk a great deal about other people during Emma, for one main reason: to alleviate or forestall boredom. She also argues that our heroine owes her vitality to gossip, as it allows imaginative and improvisational activity and an evasion of external restrictions. Going even further, a character in the novel Persuasion, this time a character who is created by Austen, declares that gossip is something that makes one know one's species better. What I would like to suggest here is that Austen is as good a student of social mores as a social linguist or an anthropologist. She's as good as them in her grasp of how gossip, conversation, chatter, and dialogues are embedded in the fabric of daily life. And I should add, the teller of tales that she's known as, but also the teller of tales that she is as a practitioner of the art of the novel, knows that the building blocks of fiction are as often as not made of anecdotes, stories of little significance in themselves, perhaps, but stories that a great writer will know how to transform into literature. The freedom of the imagination. Much has been written about how Austen's capacity to lead us into the recesses of the mind of her central characters gives us a sense of freedom. But her descriptions of her human world in movement, in a physical sense, can be just as interesting. Here are two images that tell us how to escape from the paralyzing aspects of lives defined by rules and norms. On the left, borrowed from my hardboard copy of For Young Children of Pride and Prejudice, is captured in the image of with a puppet, is the moment when Darcy Fine first crosses paths with Elizabeth Bennet. Missing, though, is the healthy, attractive glow of a face that enjoys the errand and the freedom of running away from the house. There's always more in a book than there can be in images, but this at least gives you a sense of the mobility that inhabits the world of Jane Austen. None among Austen's heroines goes hunting for tigers. They're bound for more modest journeys. It's in George Eliot that you have a dreamer who wants to go hunting for tigers rather than sit boringly in a salon. But one is on her way, she doesn't know it yet, to Pemberley, as other heroines are known to get into coaches or carriages to escape from the ordinariness that stifles them. Now, on the right, you see a period piece, namely a painting that evokes a scene, the departure of a coach, witnessed many times by an author, perhaps even from her front parlor. But allow me to suggest just for a moment that we take a different tack and that we recognize to what degree a moment such as this one is modern. We read Austen as models, maybe as prompts to our memories, and perhaps even for our aspirational desires, for the places we would like to see, the places we would like to visit. And it is striking to me when I reread her books, as I did recently, to what degree they, I might confess, bring me back to experiences that as a young woman myself, a little too bored in a small city and a little too curious about the world and a little too inclined to want to see it in its reality, is reminded of that experience when she reads Jane Austen. That's me, but I trust that if we were to discuss it after my presentation, quite a few of you might say, yes, I identify what happened here. I can project myself into that world. And that to me strikes me as a very important point to make as we move closer even to how Austen is modern. And here is a place that I want to bookmark for you, as is shown at the bottom of the screen, where I was inspired by the work of the brilliant reviewer who writes for the New Yorker, who in 2020 did a piece that insists that there's much more concreteness and much more talk about money and practicalities in the world of Austen than one has imagined. And thus, for him, Austen's books are, to use a contemporary adjective, her books are aspirational. They sketch out a world driven by the necessity, whenever possible, of upward mobility. The more money you have, the more money you make, the more money you can show, the better place you're going to be. At the same time, and how the two hang together is quite difficult to imagine, her novels are designed to fathom to what degree love in the form of a good and happy marriage can be realized. Can be realized is the word I use, awkward as it is, because, of course, in the world of Austen's fiction, which is a world of realism, you have to imagine that the spouse that is chosen for the girl is a realistic option. But love and money go together in the analysis that is provided in the piece by Louis Menon. And most strikingly, perhaps, he gives us a formula or a formulation that I think is right on target when it comes to summarizing most of the plots, I think, that we have from the fiction that is Austen's legacy. Boy meets girl, girl gets boy. And this is what Menon called the bumper sticker version of Austen, the happy end. Finding, or rather creating a happy end is of course central to the romance. The problem seems simple, but the solution is often challenging. Simple as we just reminded, for example, by the formula, boy meets girl, boy meets girl gets the boy, and they marry. And what has been done by many scholars is to actually focus on this idea of marriage as an element of the sociology, so to speak, of Austen's novels. There is a book, however, that stands out because of a different perspective. It's a 1984 book, it makes it 74, it makes it ancient almost, by Patricia Beer. And it tackles the literary aspect of this question. And this is, in fact, what I am after here. I am trying to show you to what degree what seems a simple problem, how to finish a book with a happy ending, is actually a matter of technical skill. It is a matter of finding a way or a path into a story that's different, that's not boring, and that will make it an impression, will make an impression on its reader. So with characteristic humor and irony, in Pride and Prejudice, Austen starts with a maxim that reverses the proposal. The proposal, namely, that it's going to be a girl who meets a boy who then eventually gets the boy. No, in this case, what happens is, in a few, like the first lines of her book, Pride and Prejudice, Austen reverses, switches perspectives, and places us in Mr. Bennet's household, where there are 5 girls to marry. And here is how it starts. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This sentence, Austen's first sentence, is to die for. And if there had been an editor in the days when Austen wrote, or a book agent, this would have been the sign that you're looking at an excellent product. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife is the smallest formulation possible to actually launch a project and solve a literary problem, which is the following: how to ensure that the young woman in question, an Elizabeth, a Fanny, an Emma, an Anne Elliot, remain at the center. And at the same time, how do you give them a life that has enough substance around it to actually create a novel that transports you into a fully fleshed world? What this slide tells us is that her success, or to be more precise, the way her heroines flourish and guide us to the values they embody, must be charted carefully. The slide you see on the left shows you what I mean. The writer Stendhal told us that the modern novel is akin to a mirror held up on a road. In the image that you see, Austen is featured from the back, looking into the mirror, reflecting upon the prospects of her heroines. And in order to achieve this, our author needs a strategy. It is complex and has been studied extensively. On our screen, you're seeing some of the key notions. I'll let you take a look and move on. Now, allow me for a moment the briefest of digression, just to show you something that can best be understood perhaps through an image that beautifully captures the kind of game that is being played by Austen when she sets on a course of literary invention that must take her to the right shore, while at the same time, in between, there has to be a chance for her character to interact with each other and to be playing the game, which is the game of matchmaking and the game of who gets the boy. This is a revolutionary world, the world of Jane Austen. And the contrast is all the more striking when you look at this image, which goes back to the story or the myth of Tristan and Isolde, of Tristan and Isolde, as Wagner called it. You probably know some of the elements of the story. You know, for example, that it's all a matter of sails that were the wrong color, of messages that were delivered too late, just as in Romeo and Juliet. In other words, what is astounding is to make that comparison between a world where, an ancient world, where figures inside a novel, and this is the case with texts of the 11th and 12th century, such as the legend of Tristan and Isolde, the figures inside the novel are incapable of writing or reading. They are illiterate. It's one of the things that has always surprised my students to whom I teach this novel, that in fact, the only modes of communication that the two lovers have are through signs, codes, gifts that they make to each other, because if they want to communicate something from a distance in writing, they have to use a cleric, or they have possibly the chance to hear and use what a poet says, and then ask the poet to place in their words some elements of a love story that is a love secret. The point of moving to this slide for me is to prepare you for the text that I consider to be Jane Austen's masterpiece, and that is A Novel Persuasion. And A Novel Persuasion is a novel about a secret. The secret is very central. It is the secret of a love disappointment and of a regret for a bad decision that haunts the heroine called Anne Elliot in this novel. And this novel was initially titled The Elliots. Here, let me give you just a little bit of background. And in the interest of time, I will give it to you as a kind of terse obituary of a life well spent. Austen began her last novel in January 1815, a few weeks before Emma had just seen its way into print. With her health starting to deteriorate, she rushed to finish her manuscript, battling against symptoms that included, among others, dizziness, fatigue, muscle weakness. She wrote by hand at an incredible speed, in the space of about 1 year, what is her masterpiece. It was complete in July 1816. It took Austen about a year of hard work, by hand, of course, at an extraordinary speed. She received a flattering review. The book was titled initially The Iliad. It is her swan song. It is the most romantic and the richest of her works. And the story it tells is that of a young woman, Anne Elliot, who, because of her family and because of the values that this family professes, has been forced into the renunciation of the man whom she loves. Here, just for a minute, I will tell you about what the brilliant critic Tony Tanner wrote about this novel. He wrote that Anne's story begins with what is not so much a useful error than a fatal ignorance about what it means to be young and to be in love. And Tony Tanner's illuminating formulation in a book he wrote on Austen in 1986, true love, so certain of itself, becomes self-authorizing. In other words, love wins. Love has the moral right to win. And this is what everyone would expect from a novel that starts so brilliantly and so dashingly with the image of a young man who is aiming to become not a sailor, no, something much better, who is aiming to become maybe an admiral, or at least somebody who in the Navy can explore the world. And this young man has flashed, so to speak, has been fascinated by the young, youthful, gorgeous Anne Elliot, who is only 15 years old. Only 15 years old. He's a little older, but this is youthful love. They fall in love, and she refuses him because the family has established that she's not a good party. And it must be said, what happens to Anne Elliot is partly due to the fact that she's motherless and that she's been in the charge of a very rational and very reasonable, but also not very imaginative godmother, Lady Russell, who tells her, who persuades her not to accept the offer of marriage that Captain Wentworth has made for her. In order to write that book, Jane Austen had to make a variety of decisions. So, for example, she had to decide where she was going to place the book. And one of the interesting things about the book that she wrote, that is Persuasion, was that she was herself already very ailing and sick when she wrote it. She had Addison's disease, and Addison's disease was incurable, and she had been to Bath before, but she must have remembered when she was too ill to actually travel as far, when she had to be taken to Winchester to see doctors. She must have remembered what she had seen in her youth, namely a city that was glamorous, filled with people who were doing socializing, were going to concerts, were having a spa experience at its best, with shopping and concerts included, and at the same time herself incapacitated gradually by the illness and unable to actually project herself into this scenario. So there is no look-alike for Jane Austen in her novel. There is, however, a figure that stands out, and this is the figure of her good friend, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith was her governess. She had fallen very ill at some point, mysterious illness. She came to Bath. Her husband had been there before. The two of them are obviously in some kind of treatment. And she's now a widow, Mrs. Smith. And Anne goes and visits her and talks with her and has a conversation that is both redeeming for them because shared emotions and shared suffering matters. It's redeeming in terms of its kindness, but it is also important in terms of the value it sets on taking care of others and on being kind. This is something that the family from which the heroine Anne Elliot is coming from is incapable of. They're all self-absorbed. They're all in some way or another disturbed, and they themselves actually show symptoms of illness. And it's by stating this that I can actually bring you to the place that keeps rehearsing for us the way in which Jane Austen uses illness as a mode of expression in that later novel. The illness here is not visible, but let me tell you just in a few words. The illness has to do with a mother who is overworked. She has two young children. She's kept away from all the parties and from all the dancing. And she's hoping that somebody will take over. She has a whole staff, but she's understood that poor Anne Elliot, who is already more or less like a spinster since she hasn't been able to marry, since the man that she had chosen is somebody who rejected her, and nobody, she can't love anybody else. He was the man. Anne Elliot is now often taken for granted, and in this instance, she's taken for granted for what looks like a very modern scene of babysitting. And this is where something extraordinary happens, something that will change the course of the novel and bring about this extraordinary thing that we've called a happy ending. What happens is that in the course of that evening, when the parents are away and the children are left with Anne Elliot, Captain Wentworth, who is back, and we're early in the book, and who is barely seen, caught glimpses of Anne Elliot, but just enough to think that she has lost her bloom. And this has been, of course, said and retold and as gossip to Anne Elliot. Captain Wentworth is here and will gently pick away from her back as she's struggling to keep her composure, her balance, and also just her sense of self-respect. He lifts off the children and puts them into a quiet space. And that emotion is so strong for young Anne Elliot, that was for the older Anne Elliot, forgive me, that she actually is overwhelmed. And this is how gradually we are prepared for the ending of the novel of Persuasion. Now, the ending of the novel of Persuasion is extraordinary, and we won't have time to look at it today. But what needs to be shared with you is something rather unusual here, namely an experience of reading a book that brings you quite close, in fact, almost uncomfortably close, to a world where values have been perverted, where one feels that one after the other, the world of success and gossip and superficiality has taken over, and where people are not evil, they're just self-serving and ambitious. In that world, Jane Austen has injected, so to speak, a world of kindness and goodness and an attentiveness to others, and a way she wants us to care about others that is quite extraordinary. Now, what needs to be said at this point is how difficult it might be at times to connect to the world of Jane Austen, how our brains already have gone to so far more interesting places. They've seen movies, they have the spectacle of the political, they have the chance to travel far and wide watching their screens. It's not that difficult these days to close your eyes and to not look at books. But it seems telling to me that as I was preparing this lecture, and it's something we shared with pleasure and glee, Nora and I, we had just heard about the choice made by the venerable Oxford Dictionary for the new word of the year in 2024. And here it is, brain rot, the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of overconsumption of material, now particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging, also something characterized as likely to lead to such deterioration. Now, you probably agree with me that spending an hour thinking about Austen, revising, revisiting some of our assumptions about her, shows us that there's nothing trivial about Jane Austen's writing. And one of the last impressions that I would like you to treasure as you consider rereading her, or as you are perhaps inspired to read Persuasion, which you've never read, is with what skill and what beauty she actually manages to pull together the different aspects of scenes that are created by words, but scenes that are vibrant with language, with action, with a voice that is her own voice, and that ask, among other things, what strikes me as maybe a central question when it comes to imagining love lives. Namely, what is true intimacy? What is it to be intimate with another person's thoughts? And Austen is amazingly capable of bringing us into the intimacy of her heroine's thinking, but she's also wonderfully capable, and especially in Persuasion, to show what it means to look for intimacy. Maybe it had to take 8 or 9 years, which is the time it takes for Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth to reconnect. Maybe it had to take so long for them to actually come together again and to enjoy a moment that is described by Austen as one of perfect rapture. And that moment of perfect rapture, we won't read, but I want to show you what it looks like in the world that Austen has imagined. She's already ahead of her time. She's already seen what the French impressionistic painters are going to try and capture, namely a world of impressions, of moments, events, and experiences that can take place, of course, innerly and in small spaces. And this is how Emma seems to be looking at the world, but also a world where you want to be able to go out and you want to be able to widen your views, and where there's nothing more attractive than leaning on somebody else's arm and looking around and traveling and talking in a street that might be rainy, or in a street that seems to be excessively busy with carriages. They might be noisy, it might have a lot of chatter, but there is an intimacy here that I think we should value. So here I stop and invite you to think together with Nora. We're going to try and help you do that. Think about questions that could be answered by me. And in order maybe to give you a bit of time to recover, I will go back to a slide that I think could be a good place to start a conversation.
Yeah, just as a reminder to everyone, you can place your questions in the Hopkins at Home chat, and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can in the time we have left. Looks like we already have a few that came in during the talk. So we had two sort of responses to your comments on fleshiness versus wordiness, Evelyn. So the first one comes from Carla. So she's been thinking about fleshiness versus wordiness. She suggests that fleshiness adds meaningful detail and makes writing richer and more engaging, whereas wordiness can drag the writing down, maybe make us more aware of the mediation of the text, I think. So she asks, how can you tell if your own writing is fleshy enough without becoming too wordy? And maybe also thinking about the novels that we read. And then we had a follow-up to Carla's question from Rachel, who suggests that maybe along with making writing richer and more engaging, fleshiness brings about a stronger sense of feeling, maybe in the reader. Not sure if you mean in the reader or in the character, maybe both, but Evelyn, you can weigh in there.
Yes, I love both questions. I will start with the second one, in fact, because that's to some degree the easier one. It's the question about how do you make for more feeling in writing? And that is obviously connected to the capacity to actually employ forms of language, but I would say almost forms of social interaction that are capable of reaching out to others via modes of communications that are capable of communicating individual feelings. And I go back to this idea of the text message. I've spent a lot of time in the work that I'm working on, the book I'm working on, trying to figure out where to place the question of emojis. And over time, there are more and more emojis. The repertoire is larger and larger. It's harder and harder to use them. But when they started, it was striking to me that a text message that had emoticons was in fact trying to do that work of fleshiness. That is the work of actually bringing us closer to an experience of our personhood, of our sentiments, of our ways of being that would hold onto the elements that have to do with how we feel about something and how we want to convey not only rational content and information, which is often wordiness, isn't it? And instead, we want to convey something that has to do with the capacity to listen to others and the capacity to share with them in ways that are maybe succinct, but certainly evocative of a presence. Now, on the other side, answering the first of the two questions, I suspect that this is a question that is best answered by the person who asked it, namely, who must be a writer or who loves writing, because one is the best judge, I think, of the world that one wishes to represent. It's interesting. I listen to a lot of, and I read quite a bit also about writers on writing. So, for example, Anne Patchett. And one of the things that I hear a lot is that it's easy to be too long. It's hard to be too short. Hence my somewhat, excessive enthusiasm about the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice, which struck me as brilliant, partly because it was so succinct, because it could, we use the word epitomized, but it's not that. The word is succinct. The phrasing is succinct because it tells a little with a few carefully chosen words that have a nice rhythm to them, that have some aesthetic quality. So I wish the person who asked the first question a happy time becoming even more involved in her writing or their writing and in this aesthetic pursuit.
There's another really interesting question from Cindy, and this kind of touches on the afterlife of Jane Austen's texts. So Cindy asks, I've always been fascinated by the Janeites. Do you know if World War I soldiers really were reading Austen from the trenches, or is that a fiction? If it's true, what do you think the particular appeal was for soldiers in reading Austen?
Yeah. That is the kind of question that if, Cindy, if you were to go back and dig out the article by, the review article by Louis Minon would give you sources to examine. I am a specialist of narrative and narration. I don't know every corner of the recent research that has been done by scholars in the field of the Janeites, the academics who are into Jane Austen full time, so to speak. But what I do know is that Churchill, for example, read Jane Austen, which is surprising. And I found that out by reading Louis Minon's review. And what I also understand is the power that books have to actually enable you to escape from a world and to aspire. I have to use my word aspirational here, to aspire to another world as just a reaction, so to speak, to what is happening in the brutality of a contemporary world. I have a former colleague who in a project on cultures of reading who was very eloquent about the way in which a city like Boston had created buses for homeless people. And in these buses for homeless people, they could come and pick up either an iPhone where they could read the book or a hardbound book. Well, guess what? They all wanted the hardbound book, as if getting the book as a gift, holding it in their hands, was a much more substantive experience for what we hark after, I think, when we want to travel into other worlds and other worlds. We want to be able to lose ourselves more fully. And all the science shows that reading in an electronic source does not have the same impact as reading on paper, as is true also of writing. Writing by hand is more focused, is more absorptive, it's more creatively generating than is just reading on the screen or typing on the screen.
Okay, on the topic of screens, this will be the last question, I think, and maybe we'll keep the answers short just so we can finish up. But Veronica asked, do you have a favorite movie adaptation of Austen that you think got it right, or favorite cinematic portrayal of an Austen heroine?
I was very impressed by Autumn the Winter's adaptation. And that's how and why I recommended it. I was hoping to watch it again before I give my lecture, but in a way, at some point I decided it was better not. It's the kind of movie that is so good, so strong, that it actually will populate your mind with images that somehow interfere with the purity, so to speak, of the reading experience. So I, by all means, try and find it, as I'm sure it's on Netflix and other channels of dispensation of good successful films. It's brilliant. It's a satire, but it is also visually stunning. And one of the reasons we talked about it with Nora, one of the reasons we were thinking about, one of the things we were discussing when we were talking about the slides was, should we still, in that early part where we talk about hair, have a still from the film? Even if you just look at the trailer for the movie, you're going to see that much has been put into the decor as if you needed to create in cinema the equivalent of what you're looking at still on my screen, namely a caption, a way of capturing a moment in its aesthetics and in its beauty that is shaped artistically. There's a lot of artistic shaping and a lot about art, for example. So the first thing I realized to what degree it was important that there are two piano players in Emma. I knew that, of course. There's Jane Fairfax and there is Emma. But gosh, Jane Fairfax is so much better at playing the piano. And I end with this note of humor because one of the things that is absolutely brilliant in Jane Austen is how well she writes about women. I think this was our last question, was it, Nora?
Yeah, that's our last question.
Okay, well,
Thank you everyone for posing them.
thank you to my audience. It's a little disconcerting not to be seeing faces, but I wish you, as I should, happy holiday season and much enjoyment in hopefully reading more Jane Austen than you have ever read.